So when Russell asked me to come speak, I thought it was an auspicious day. I don't know if there are any Marines in the crowd, but today is the Marine Corps birthday. So 241 years. So if you happen to know any Marines in your life, are you a Marine? No, but if you know any Marines in your life, tell them happy birthday today. So I thought it would be a great day. What I hadn't thought about is that we would be essentially 24 hours after the election. So it's sort of the elephant in the room. Right, today nobody particularly wants to talk about the Marine Corps birthday. They don't want to talk about Wall Street as long as it's not down too much. I walked around New York City yesterday. I swear the entire city was in shock. I know my entire office was depressed. And it's interesting because I've talked to a number of people in a number of different forums about the leadership principles and the principles that I have in the book, and I tend to talk about them from the perspective of deal making because that's mostly what I do now, or about running companies. And as I was last night and this morning thinking about coming here, everything just sort of comes back to the flaming election. It's just all anybody wants to talk about. Anytime you have a cup of coffee, it's all anybody wants to talk about. I'll try and I'll keep it to the 15 minutes or so that I said, but we'll try to marry them both together. A number of people have asked me, why did I write a book, and why did I write a book about this? And it's a little bit of a complicated story, but I will say that for years, I would see people do things that I thought were dumb. Sometimes they were malfeasancy things, sometimes they were illegal things, and sometimes they were just dumb things. So what I mean by that from my perspective as a banker is, I would see Wells Fargo fire 5,000 people who created 2 million accounts for people who had no idea accounts were being set up for them. And I would say, why do they do these things? It's just dumb, right? Why can't people run businesses, run their lives using the same principles that I learned when I was in the Marine Corps? And people would say, why don't you write a book about it? I thought it was a cool idea, but I wasn't sure exactly how to do that. And so for a number of years, I sort of assembled ideas into folders, and it took me 4 or 5 years, and eventually it all came together in the book. But not all of the dumb things I've seen are along the lines of what Wells Fargo did in ripping off a whole bunch of people that they should have valued as customers. Sometimes from a deal-making standpoint, I would see, take 2 recent deals in the news, Microsoft buying LinkedIn and Verizon buying Yahoo, just because they're in my mind and I'm in the deal business and I look at those things. To me, Microsoft buying LinkedIn was dumb, and Verizon buying Yahoo was not. And the reason for that is that Microsoft buying LinkedIn is a cool company. I like LinkedIn. I'm one of the first 1,000 users ever of LinkedIn. Everybody in my company uses LinkedIn. We use LinkedIn not only to find relationships between people, we actually use it as a recruiting tool. I like LinkedIn. It's a great company. The question is, how did buying LinkedIn advance Microsoft towards a clearly defined strategy? And my answer is, it doesn't. It's just a really cool company. It's in the right place. It uses the cloud. It uses crowdsourcing. It's fully buzzword compliant. But it doesn't move them ahead towards a clearly defined strategy. Whereas Verizon buying Yahoo, to me, made sense. It was smart because they already owned AOL. And they had a clearly defined strategy to make AOL into the leader in sports, entertainment, news for consumers, and adding Yahoo to it clearly moved them forward. And so the first principle that I talk about in my book is called take the long view. And And a lot of things stem from taking the long view. The long view basically says all tactics ought to be designed to advance you, to advance the organization towards a clearly defined strategic goal. So how'd Hillary lose? Because that's a question everybody's asking on the news. How'd she lose? I don't know about the rest of you. I have a bunch of Facebook friends. I've seen everything blamed from it's sexism, people don't want a woman to be president. I've seen that a whole bunch on Facebook, and I'm betting that a number of you have seen that. I've seen it's racism. I've seen it's fight against multiculturalism. I've seen all of these comments. My short answer, which a lot of my friends don't like, is that she ran a lousy campaign. Or if you prefer, he ran a better campaign. It's when I see this morning on Facebook, she's clearly smarter than he is. How could they vote for somebody that wasn't as smart? Okay, John Carey was smarter than W too. Carey lost. It wasn't sexism. W ran a better campaign. How did he run a better campaign? Well, amongst other things, he took the long view. All of his strategy, all of his tactics were designed to accomplish a fairly clear goal. He identified, and I could spend 15, 20 minutes just on this subject, so I'll move on in a minute. But he identified a core group of people that he wanted to appeal to. It wasn't a classically Republican-defined view of the world. It was a group of people who were largely working class people who were not happy about the fact that even if they hadn't lost jobs, friends had lost jobs. They weren't worried about the fact that their kids may not be able to afford college. Worried about how they move forward and keep bread on the table for their families, and really don't want to take welfare. And he went hard after them, and at the same time he decided he'd paint Hillary as Crooked Hillary. Whether right or wrong, that was his goal, was to paint her as Crooked Hillary and a tool of the elite establishment. He stuck to it. All of his tactics were designed to do that. He ran a better campaign. He took the long view. He focused on it. I have 11 principles, and I could spend 15 minutes on each, and they're all in the book. The second principle in the book, though, is called Take a Stand. Some people interpret take a stand to mean that you should be decisive, because decisive is sort of a trait in the Marine Corps, but it's not really about being decisive, although I am a big fan of leaders being decisive and figuring out the answer. It's about being willing to be true to yourself, to be true to your own moral principles, whatever they are, and if necessary, to be willing to speak truth to power. There are many examples that I can give of that. We were just talking about Wells Fargo. How different things would have been if some mid-level managers at Wells Fargo had been willing to take a stand, go to bosses and insist we're doing something wrong. If we don't stop, we're going to be in trouble, and take a stand, and sometimes be willing to lose a job over it. How different would things be if some mid-level managers at General Motors had gone to executives, or some executives had gone to more senior executives and taken a stand and said, we can't put out another car with a faulty ignition switch. And I don't know, something like 51, 52 people died as a result of faulty ignition switches. How different would things be at Volkswagen if some senior people at Volkswagen had taken a stand and said, we can't put out cars that cheat on emission tests? And when people fail to take a stand, too often it has these long-term ramifications on business. Too many people, I think, when this election came to believe, perhaps because of Mr. Trump's campaigning, that Hillary wasn't true to her own principles, that she'd move, that she wasn't the leader that would take a stand on things if they didn't advance her towards her own personal goals. Now, I didn't say I personally believe that about Hillary, and I'll be upfront, I voted for Hillary. But she got successfully painted as a person who would not take a stand and be true to her own moral principles all the time, as somebody who started out not believing that the federal minimum wage should come up, but she got pushed to change that position when Bernie was winning votes because he had it. She started out as a person who was not in favor of the federal government getting involved in college tuition for people, but she got pushed to that position when Bernie was winning votes because he had that. She started out as a person who was for the Trans-Pacific Partnership and got pushed to saying she was against the Trans-Pacific Partnership because it looked like she was going to lose votes, and the list goes on. She was not a person who was perceived as somebody who was willing to stay true to her own principles, whereas whether you like Mr. Trump or not my favorite person, but he was perceived as somebody who would stick to his principles whether the rest of the world agreed with him or not. It's been an interesting time to watch this happen. The third principle in my book is interesting as we talk about some of the stuff. It's called be an expert or use one. To me, that's a little bit of a reaction against the generalists that I see on the planet. For me, there are too many generalists. My father, who is now 92 and is retired as an engineer from the Cummins Engine Company, my father developed Cummins small diesel engines that you now see in Ram pickup trucks. And earlier in his career, he worked in aerospace, and he worked on the air conditioning system they used in the Mercury and the Gemini space capsules. My father used to come home and whine about the people who ran both the aerospace business and Cummins, and talk about the fact that these guys went to really good schools, they had MBAs, they knew how to negotiate, they know marketing, they know finance, they know labor relations, but they were running an engine company and they didn't know a crankshaft from a piston rod. How do you run an engine company if you don't really understand engines? How do you take it to the next level if you're a generalist manager? And I believe that. I believe that leaders need to become domain experts in the specific domain that they are trying to lead. It is not good enough to be a generalist leader. And in fact, I'll go further than that and say that a key difference between management and leadership is that managers tend to operate within a set of constraints. They're reasonable constraints. They're the constraints that they're given. It's the products that they're given, it's the industry that they're given, it's the market that they're given, it's the employee base that they're given. And then given that, they need to do their best given those constraints. It's leaders who figure out how to go beyond the constraints. Somebody much more famous than I once said that the reasonable man sees the way the world is and conforms himself to that world. The unreasonable man sees the way the world is and persists in trying to conform the world to himself. There would be no progress in life without the unreasonable man. It's what leadership is about. It is about a refusal to accept the constraints. The interesting thing from the election perspective is that there can be no doubt that Hillary believes not only that she was an expert, but that she employed experts in helping her to become president of the United States. So why didn't it work? And in fact, if you read the media, and I will say that my wife works for CBS News, and we pay a fair amount of attention to the media in various forms. We read multiple newspapers, we watch the news. If you watch the media, they portrayed Trump's organization as run by a bunch of clown amateurs, as run by his son-in-law, as run by people who were not expert in running a campaign, and yet he won. And now the postmortem begins, but one of the things that begins to come through is that his experts may have been better than her experts, that her experts segmented the population the way it's always been segmented. And so Minnesota is a traditional Democratic state, don't worry about it. Same thing with Michigan. Same thing with Pennsylvania. Don't worry about it. We're going to go. We're going to define some states that have traditionally been on the edge, and we're going to go campaign there. Whereas he had a bunch of experts that weren't out of the political machine. They were people who understood consumer dynamics and consumer marketing, and he targeted a different group of people. Experts matter. They matter a lot. There are a number of principles here, and I promised I'd be done here in about 4 minutes, so I'll do a couple of others, and then we can either take questions or do what you want. A couple of principles. One is around the concept of knowing yourself. Knowing yourself sounds easy, sounds logical, sounds like something everybody should do. It is amazing how often people fool themselves about their own strengths and their own weaknesses and their own capabilities. And, you know, General Mattis, who's a Marine Corps general who led Marines in Iraq and is a Trump supporter and is touted as a possible Secretary of Defense. We will see. But General James Mattis once said, the worst thing you can do in combat is to fool yourself about yourself. It's dangerous. It can wind up getting you killed. You need to know your own strengths, your own weaknesses, and you need to be willing to confront the harsh reality of them as you define your own tactics. Again, I'll say, I think that Hillary overestimated hers. I think that Trump understood his weaknesses, and he played to a different group. Knowing, I call it knowing the enemy in the book is another principle. I've had a little bit of pushback where people have said the people on the other side of the table are not necessarily your enemy. I agree with that. I don't treat people on the other side of a negotiation as my enemy. They're not trying to kill me. They're not trying to take away my family. But they are trying to take bread off my table. They are trying to make money at my expense. And the one thing I say about knowing the enemy, knowing the other people on the other side is it's too easy to use caricatures. It's too easy in war to paint the people on the other side as ignorant and they hate Americans and they're just racist and they just want to kill us, as opposed to understanding their motivations, understanding who they are, understanding why they feel the way they feel. And we do this in business, and I think people do it in politics. And to paint the Trump supporters as a bunch of intolerables, a bunch of Bible-toting, gun-carrying, racist crazies, misses who those people are. There are some people who had jobs in manufacturing and don't anymore, or know people who don't. There are people who are frightened for themselves and for their kids, and there are people who see an elite establishment who is more concerned about being politically correct and bringing in immigrants than they are about protecting people who are worried about their own health care, worried about their kids. And to demonize those people is not only wrong, it can also cost you an election. So there's 11 principles in the book. I think I just went through 5 or 6 of them. I said I'd be done at 8:30, and it's 8:30. I'm happy to take questions, and then we can chat.
So first of all, thank you for this great presentation. And I want to recommend everybody to order this book and recommend this book to other leaders within your own organization. I read the book. I love the book. As a matter of fact, we have a deep interview with Ken Marlin's, we had an interview in the past, so you'll be able to go to Sarder TV and watch that interview also. But great principles. Take the long view, take a stand, be an expert, knowing yourself. I always believe that is a strategy without action is hallucination. And applied knowledge is power. So we have to take this principle that you talked about, we have to apply within our own organization. Thank you, sir. Thank you for your time.
Thank you.